Welcome back to another edition of the Night Report podcast. I'm your host, Mike Broadbent. Joining me once again, my co-host, Alec Krauthamel, and special guest to talk Rutgers Golden Gophers is none other than Daniel House. He is the founder of Gophers Guru and an expert ball knower. Daniel, thanks for joining us, man.
Hey, thanks for having me. Fun matchup this week. All the narratives, man. I tell you what, when we play, when Minnesota plays Rutgers, I'm always like, there'll be plenty to talk about.
Yeah, it's like an awkward family reunion each time they line up on the field. And it seems like they've been lining up almost every year recently. So maybe the Big Ten knows that there's some serious narratives out there. But before we get into the game at all, this podcast is once again presented to you by FanDuel. And Rutgers currently is sitting at a 5.5-point dog on FanDuel. The over-under is set at 50.5 points. I hope by the end of this podcast, you guys will have a firm idea of which direction you should be betting this game. But Daniel, we are in year 9 of the PJ Fleck experience, the row the boats. What does he say at the end of each press conference? Because he says it so fast that I can't even pick it up.
Roll the boat, Ski-U-Mah, go Gophers. Because Ski-U-Mah is one of the traditional sayings at Minnesota, and then he paired roll the boat up with it, and then he's got the go Gophers. So he does that after every press conference.
So I did a bit of a dive into PJ Fleck, his kind of like records, and I didn't realize Minnesota had 5 trophy games, 12-7 in trophy games as the Golden Gophers head coach, 6-15 against ranked opponents. What's the general kind of consensus by the fan base about where things stand with PJ Fleck in year 9?
Yeah, I think people are just, excited to see how the season plays out with a brand new quarterback. You know, they invested in Drake Lindsay, a 4-year recruit out of Arkansas who, possesses a lot of talent to be able to make all the throws in the offense and, being able to develop for a year with Max Brosmer. Now everybody wants to see, can this guy kind of usher you into another era of Gopher football, and what's going to help Minnesota take the next step as a program? Are they going to be able to put themselves in the conversation where they can compete, put themselves in the position to, with the expansion of the college football playoff, like get yourself in that conversation occasionally and take the next step as a program? And so I think every program right now is going through an evolution when it comes to how do you build your team, where do you put your money, how do you strike the right balance between positions that, influence the outcome of games and maybe those that don't? And so I think that's going to be the big challenge for not just Minnesota, but every program moving forward is how do you adapt to this landscape? So I think Minnesota and PJ Fleck, they're trying to figure out what that looks like and, adapt to all the changes.
Now, looking into this matchup in particular, we kind of talked about it before we started. The narratives are all over the place. I mean, it's Rutgers and Minnesota. You got PJ Fleck, who's a Greg Schiano assistant. You got Kirk Schrock, who came over from Minnesota. Rob Smith was a Minnesota defensive coordinator at one point. Joe Harrison, Corey Hetherin. Heck, Ethan Kaliak-Manis used to be at Minnesota. They flip players back and forth. I mean, the narratives never end with the flip-flop between these two teams. Yeah. I guess from the Minnesota side, what does this matchup look like in terms of, the storylines, the excitement, trying to get back at Ethan after Rutgers won at SHI Stadium last year? What does that all look like?
Yeah, I mean, you name it, you got a storyline. Both coordinators at Rutgers, Kirk Schrock, Rob Smith. Then you got the quarterback and Ethan Kaliak-Manis. You got Dino Kaliak-Manis coming back. All people that, Minnesota fans are quite familiar with. Kirk's one of those guys that, I got to know during his time here. I think he's an outstanding coach. He puts his players in phenomenal positions for success. The guy's preparation, attention to detail. And the thing I'd say is, like, he always has answers for what the defense is doing in game. His system's so structured that, like, if you see this look, here's where he's going to pivot. And that's what's made him so successful is he has a system, but he's got answers off of it. And he's done a great job developing Ethan. I mean, I think, you look at the progression of him over time, I felt like it was mechanically, improving the platform, becoming more compact in his release, being able to vary the tempo of throws. And I think short and intermediate throws, he had that tendency to really rocket the football. And now you see him starting to be able to change the pace, vary the tempo, be accurate at all 3 levels. I think he's got the highest average depth of target among all Big Ten quarterbacks right now. So it's one of those things where Kirk's got that system where, if you're going to RPO play zone, he's going to RPO you. And then when you want to get get out of that RPO situation, then you play man and he's going to stretch you down the field. So, I think there's a lot of great storylines in this game. Ethan's progression, Kirk's ability to develop him, and then, what can Minnesota do with Rob Smith's defense? I mean, I think that's been the storyline when I watch Rutgers play is, inconsistencies against the run, leveraging the ball carrier, lining well with run fit. So I think, those are all the things that I'm watching for from a storyline standpoint.
Yeah, it is kind of like if you would have told Rutgers fans that when they hired Kirk Soraka in 3 years, a quarter of the way through the season, you'll have the quarterback with the most passing yards in the Big Ten, or close to it. Sorry, I don't think he's got it anymore. I think Jaden Mayab at USC does now, but he's going to have the highest big-time throw percentage. He's going to have the lowest turnover-worthy play percentage. He's going to have the highest average depth of target. Like, we wouldn't have believed you. And here we are with Ethan Kaliak-Manis, who, by all, accounts was kind of like it was a mutual parting. But I think both parties were happy to kind of be rid of one another. What do you think is kind of the main reason that, that divorce ended up happening?
Well, I think it's one of those things where Ethan had, different offensive systems during his time there. He had Mike Sanford as a play caller one year. He had, Kirk Soraka come back. Then he had Greg Harbaugh for a year, and then, Kirk at Rutgers now. So I think when you look at that, the offensive style that Kirk runs fits kind of his game a little bit better. Where I think, Minnesota was putting in a different type of offense that was very demanding on the quarterback at the line of scrimmage. There's a lot of language to it. I felt like, he had a comfort level learning in what Kirk was doing. Kirk recruited him. So I think there was a natural pull there. And, Minnesota was looking to try to find a quarterback that maybe fit that system that they were looking to run best. And I thought, Ethan made a good choice when it comes to pairing up with Kirk. You see what Kirk's been able to do, developing quarterbacks, adapting to their strengths. I think that's what he's done a great job of with Ethan is, developing him mechanically, developing mentally, understanding what defenses are doing, and then, maximizing his talent, just refining everything. When you spend enough time with Kirk Soraka in his offense, you're naturally going to see a progression of growth and development. And I think that's been the case. I mean, he looks comfortable. He looks confident. Watching Kirk for all the years that I did here at Minnesota and even going back to Western when he came to Minnesota, that's what you notice is like he gets his hands on a quarterback, he'll invest in him and you'll notice growth. So, I mean, I always liked working with Ethan. He was great. I'm happy to see him, having success with Kirk, who's a great guy as well.
Yeah, that's one thing I've noticed is generally Gophers fans don't really have a whole lot of malice towards Ethan, which is usually a good sign when, it's not like the, F him kind of narrative that you see sometimes when a player leaves. Like even when a guy like Jaden Daniels left Arizona State, a lot of Arizona State fans were like, yeah, he sucked anyway, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, they're probably not tooting that tune anymore. But obviously, football is a physical sport. Injuries are starting to pile up for everybody. Talk a little bit about where things stand on the injury front for the Gophers heading into this game.
Yeah, I mean, running back position is obviously the one that everybody's dialing in on. Darius Taylor, he ended up, pulling up in the Northwestern State game, didn't play versus Cal. PJ Fleck's pretty tight-lipped when it comes to injuries, and, the injury report's going to come out 2 hours before the game. We'll see if he's available. He's had hamstring type of deals in the past. We don't know if it's for sure a hamstring, but that's kind of the projection out there is that it might be a hamstring. So if that's the case, is that a lingering injury? Is he ready to go? They had a bye week. We'll find out, game time decision type of deal. And then AJ Turner, the backup running back, he was injured in the Cal game, had to be helped off the field. That injury didn't look particularly great. So that means you're probably down to running Femi Ijiboy, who I thought played really well against California. Broke 9 tackles. It was like the highest forced missed tackle output by a Gopher running back in a regular season game since 2023. So, I mean, he was able to break tackles, work well in the wide zone and mid zone scheme. So keep an eye on running back. I think Minnesota, they're getting into the depth part of the running back room. Other than that, I think, that's the main position that Minnesota's experiencing some injury stuff at.
You kind of touched on this a little earlier, but Greg Harbaugh is in his third year as the offensive coordinator, fourth year on staff. How does this offense kind of evolve since he's gotten here, and what does it look like today?
That's a great question. I think Minnesota's evolved a ton offensively. It's more of an NFL style system. You kind of see a Shanahan, like Kevin O'Connell, McVay type of blend in what they do offensively. Like you say, complex language. It's something that everybody's got to learn and pick up on. I think continuity is really important on offense. That's why I think sometimes it takes some time when Minnesota gets transfers to get them up to speed on the language. But when it hits, then you start to see them be able to execute full elements of the system, layering up pass game stuff. I think you'll see some stuff at the beginning of the game that, Greg will introduce, and then, he'll build off of that design as the game progresses. They've increased their pre-snap motion usage, being able to move guys around, set up matchups, the wide zone, mid zone running game schemes. I guess I'm curious to kind of see what they do run game wise, personnel with their tight ends, with the mobility of their offensive line. Are they going to put more gap scheme runs in? I don't know. With the running back situation they have, are those guys ready to execute a full menu of rushing concepts? But I think Greg has expanded the offense to the point where you got to have a quarterback that can mentally do stuff at the line of scrimmage. Like Max Brosner last year, going up to the line of scrimmage with multiple options, being able to check into the right play. Now you see him in the NFL being able to fit perfectly into Kevin O'Connell's offense. That's because the system is very NFL style. And so I think, Minnesota's big thing moving forward here is they got to be able to run the ball with some more consistency to get that play action passing attack going. But yeah, the offense is a lot different from when Kirk was here, more of the RPO based system to, NFL style look.
So you touched on last year's quarterback and Max Brosmer. Let's talk about this year's quarterback in Drake Lindsay. I've listened to a lot of PJ Fleck and Minnesota content this past week, and PJ Fleck talked about how this is kind of something different than a lot of schools are doing. Like normally you go get a veteran in the transfer portal. You don't really commit yourself this early to a freshman quarterback, but they're doing it because of what they see in Drake Lindsay. Talked about he's an Arkansas kid. He's from Fayetteville, Arkansas. He's from a Razorback family. I think his sister plays volleyball or basketball for the Razorbacks. His dad played for the Razorbacks. He played for Bud Grant too with the Vikings. So there's an interesting connection there. Yep. But what is it about Drake Lindsay that you've seen so far and what you've kind of heard talked about with him that kind of gives Gophers fans and Gophers coaching staff so much high hopes for him?
Yeah, I mean, he was an overlooked type of player, early in the recruiting process. And then, Minnesota honed in on him and said, this guy fits the system very well. I remember going to a camp and watching him throw, and the immediate thing you could see is just anticipation, being able to work the middle of the field, work from the opposite hash, drive corner routes, outbreakers, those type of balls. And I think you see that now when he's playing out on the field, that anticipation, that arm strength, ability to make throws at all three levels. And what I've said is, it comes down to the people around him. Are they able to protect? Do they have the playmakers and everything, the whole ecosystem to make him successful early on in his career? And I think through the first three games, Drake's handled things well, pocket presence wise, being able to execute elements of the offense. When pressure's coming, he knows where to go with the ball, being able to work through some of the progressions and the concepts that they're running. There's been a few mistakes here or there, but they haven't been catastrophic. They've been learning moments where, you're learning about the type of coverage you're seeing and what you can and can't do, and the tight window throws that you can and can't make. Maybe you can get away with that at the high school level. Now those windows tighten when the speed gets even faster here in the Big Ten. So I want to see how he does when he's going against a Big Ten defense that's dynamic, fast. It's going to challenge throws. I think Rutgers presents some challenges in the sense that their DBs are very aggressive. They're going to play, some man coverage and high leverage spots, and they're going to test his ability to, throw people open and throw into tighter windows. So I think Drake has progressed well. He fits the system. And now it's all about, can that supporting cast, can they run the ball and get all the pieces to come together? And he's going to learn in these Big Ten games. It's a whole different beast coming into conference play here.
Yeah, it's 100%. And we found that out last week with Iowa, and how much different the game is when you're in the big boy conference here. I had a couple of general offensive questions before we dive into like position by position. One of the things that I kind of took as an anecdote from one of the Minnesota pods is in your two FBS games this year, Minnesota's had 9 drives that got into opposing territory that resulted in 0 points. Is that just bad luck? Is it, I noticed like some of them is like you're calling a run on 3rd and 7 and into, a bad look. And one of them was like, a karate kick interception by a defender, one of the luckiest interceptions I've ever seen. But like, what generally would you point to for the lack of offensive efficiency once you get on the opposing side of the ball?
Yeah, I think some of it is, running the ball with, improved efficiency. Like you say, being able to control the line of scrimmage, get separation in the passing game, be able to set designs up that, put playmakers in the best position for success. I think it could be, here or there. It's like, maybe it's an execution thing where you got to design open. Maybe it's ball placement. Maybe it's, winning with physicality at the catch point. There's a couple really highly contested balls where, it might get labeled as a drop by some people, but like it was a really good play by the defender being able to disrupt it. I think that like there's some execution detail things, being able to run the ball better. I don't think like it's a chronic, there's a chronic issue that you can underline and as to why. I just think that, executing and putting yourself in positions where, you're able to make the available play. I think that's a lot of it.
And then, so looking at the running backs, you kind of talked about it already with some of the injury issues, but largely Minnesota as a program has done a really good job of developing running backs and having really solid backs in general. What do you think is the biggest key to that, and what does this run game look like, heading into this Saturday?
It's different. Darius Taylor provides value as a pass catcher too. He's one of the better pass catching running backs in the whole country last year. So that added another element to their offense and the route design aspect. So if he's unavailable, AJ Turner transfer from Marshall. He's more of the home run hitting type of back that you can get out on the perimeter. If he can't go, then you're down to Femi Ijiboy, a second-year player, a little bit of blend of burst and power. He can accelerate in the second and third levels, good at breaking tackles, making guys miss, making the first defender miss, which is a huge part of what they do in the, wide zone and mid zone type of blocking schemes that they like to use. He's complemented by Cam Davis out of Washington, transfer, veteran guy. Had a whole bunch of touchdowns that 1 year at Washington, more as a goal line back, physical between the tackles type of runner to complement him. So I think that's what you're going to see a lot of is Femi and Cam Davis if Darius and AJ are unable to go.
Is it fair to say that you guys have struggled to run the ball a bit? Some of the stats are pretty impressive given like your third down conversion rate. You're converting on third downs at like a 58% clip, which is 12th in the nation, but your average third down distance is 7.2 yards, which is like 79th in the nation. So
Yep.
It feels like you guys are moving the ball but struggling. And is that due to mainly the running game, or would you point to something else?
Yeah, I'd say running the ball with consistency is the big deal. You look at their ability to run the ball left versus running right. You break it down, you refine it. I think they've done, a lot better running to the left. And, there's some changes that were made on the right side. They got a, transfer right guard, transfer right tackle, figuring some things out on the offensive line. I think that's been the storyline, is trying to get that group to play, cohesive and be able to generate consistent movement in the run game. You mentioned it, being in passing down situations. I mean, the Cal game, I think they were in passing down situations at something like a 41% clip. And that's the thing that impressed me most about Drake is like there was one drive where there was 5 third down conversions in the Cal game, several of them being at longer distances. He's able, layer in an over route to Lemecki Brockington, throw an opposite hash out breaking ball to Lemecki versus cover 3, like be able to process the defense and get the ball out to the right spot. So I think that's what I'm saying. Like if Drake can be in better, down and distance situations, especially when you get to third down, I think that's going to put him in some positions for success to really shine in the play action game. So running the ball, I think that's obviously very important. I think this is a game where, misdirection, attacking eye discipline of Rutgers defense is going to be the calling card here. You had an extra week to get ready. So what can you do to try to, set things up and get guys out of gaps in the run game?
Yeah, you mentioned Lemecky Brockington. Let's talk about the pass catching group. It seems like there's a pretty established top two guys between him and Javon Tracy, and then you guys have thrown a good amount to your tight end, Jamison Gears. Just kind of talk about, where the receiver room is in its development and kind of where they are as playmakers, because I've noticed some interesting stats about the pass game that I'll touch on in a little bit, but just talk.
I think Lemecky has made a lot of progress. Lemecky Brockington, he spent a lot of time this offseason when I was talking to him about nuance at the top of routes, and I think you saw that across route types versus Cal being able to get separation. He's become a guy that Drake obviously likes throwing the ball to. Javon Tracy, transfer out of Miami of Ohio, guy that is very good at breaking tackles. That's something you saw at Miami of Ohio when he's in open space. Being able to create yards after the catch. He's someone I think they can get involved over the middle of the field, feature some of those skills in the offensive system. Jalen Smith's gotten a lot of run, younger player that's still learning, I think, trying to adjust to the speed of the game, the physicality, being able to win, in tighter contested catch type of situations. But someone that they like a lot has made progress in his development. I'm interested to see Logan Loya out of the bye week here, transfer to UCLA. I like them a lot. I think he's a sudden route runner, good in the quick game underneath route tree. Hasn't gotten a lot of targets yet. So I'd like to see him, them try to find ways to get him involved, find a rhythm in the quick passing game. Loya is someone I think that still has a lot of potential, that they can find ways to feature him creatively. But that's kind of the core mix of guys right now in the pass catching room. You mentioned Jamison Gears. They like to throw to him in the red zone a lot. So when you get down in that red area, watch for Gears as a guy to go up and get the football. They like to involve him in the concepts down there.
Two stats I picked up from a Minnesota podcast. I forget which one, so apologies. The first is the top four Minnesota receivers have a combined contested catch rate of 27%. So 50-50 balls. Would you say that that's been an issue this year so far?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some situations where, the ball's been contested. I think, like I say, with Jalen Smith getting used to the physicality of the Big Ten, getting position, attacking the football. I do think that they can be more consistent in that area. I know there's been a lot of talk about drops. I think some of those, it's like, was the coverage solid? Did the guy make a good play on it? Was it borderline? Yeah, there were some situations where you want to bring the ball in, but I think, physicality, getting position at the catch point is something that you talk about. Contested catch receivers. Let's talk about Rutgers, man. I love their wide receivers, man. That's honestly, watching Big Ten wide receiver, that's one of my favorite wide receiver rooms. I mean, that unit can attack the football.
Yeah, they were. Iowa was playing Rutgers extremely physically on Friday night and kind of daring the refs to, because they basically got the Shaq rules against our guys. Because we have 6'6" KJ Duff, we got 6'3" Ian Strong. Both are very physically imposing, and you kind of you can get away with a lot of stuff. Especially, Iowa doesn't play anyone that's seemingly under 22 years old either. So that plays a part. They're all veterans. They all kind of have those crafty moves. They all know grabbing jersey is always going to get called, but if you grab an arm, you grab a wrist, that's the stuff you can kind of get away with. And they were doing it all night.
Kirk's got a basketball team, man. He's got the center, he's got the power forward, he's got the point guard and DT Sheffield. I mean, gosh, when he has the receivers to run that offense, that's when that thing really starts to hum. And I think that's what you see this year.
Yeah, that's when you guys had, Rashad Bateman, Tyler Johnson. That's the 2019 season where you guys really popped off. And yeah, it was on the backs of, a really good running game and an experienced quarter. Well, I guess Tanner Morgan wasn't that experienced at the time, but the receivers were just incredible that year.
Yeah, and that's what happens. You be able to. It's more multidimensional, their offense. You want to play zone to take away the passing game, then you're going to get RPO'd, and then you want to put people in the box to take away the run, then you're going to throw the ball down the field. And I think this is one of the best wide receiver rooms Kirk's had. I mean, looking at all his stops and where he's been, this thing is you can really do a lot of stuff with the playmakers.
I got one more on the Minnesota receiver room before we move on. Lemecky Brockington leads you guys in basically every category. But He's got 17 yards after the catch combined on his 10 receptions. Would you say that's a ball placement issue, just the kind of a factor of the kind of routes he's running? Where would you kind of point to the lack of like kind of yards after the catch with him?
I think some of it's a route type. Some of it is, being able to break a tackle, get in a spot where you're catching the ball and then be able to extend the play. I think the ball placement's been fine. Like the accuracy's been good. Leading receivers open. I think that's a strength of Drake's game. I think it's just skill set wise trying to generate more yards after the catch. I think they were better in that category, last year. Now it's like, okay, can you get Javon Tracy more involved? Because I think he's the best yak, ability to break tackles type of guy. Lemecki is more like the finesse, nuance, get open, win at the top of the route type of wide receiver, and not as, dynamic in the yak category as some of the other guys. So, I think early on, we pretty small sample size. I want to see when we get some, more games here, how they perform in that category and how Greg kind of sets stuff up. I think motioning guys for access, getting them opportunities where they're getting more favorable matchups. I think that's going to be important to set up rubs and clean releases against Rutgers when they're in man coverage in this game.
Now looking at the offensive line, which kind of, can kind of unlock the whole offense. You're switching around a lot of production from last year. Ariante Ursary, to name one, is in the NFL with the Texans. What does this unit look like for the offensive line and opening up the run game? And how is it kind of progressed from last year where, again, not a lot of returning production coming back?
That's the thing. I mean, coming into the season, I knew that it was going to take some time. They had some new faces up there. Where were guys going to play? Greg Johnson played center last year. He moved to left guard, which I think is a more natural fit for his game. Ashton Beers was a right guard. He moved to center. He's played very well at center. I think the left guard and center situations, solid. No issues there. But now you got a brand new left tackle, Nathan Royce, second-year player out of Wisconsin, was a highly rated recruit. He's very athletic, one of the more athletic big guys on the team. He's learning, he's growing, he's gaining experience. So, you're at the point where, you're willing to invest in his development. I think the left side is okay. I think the right side is where there's, question marks. You got Dylan Ray, a transfer from Kentucky. He's more primarily a guard type of skill set at Kentucky. He's playing at the tackle spot. You got Marcellus Marshall, transfer from UCF, playing right guard. I think that's the most natural spot for him to play. But that's the spot where Minnesota seems to have the most, inconsistency is on the right side of that offensive line. So what do they do out of the bye week? Maybe they come out with some 6 offensive line stuff to create some extra gaps in the run game. They have a lot of bodies that are like guard type of skill sets. I think 6-0 line packages could give them some juice. And I think sparking the run game with, a lot of misdirection, trying to alter the eye discipline of Rutgers defense is the key. Pass protection wise, I think that right side is where you got to watch the right tackle spot. Can you stunt, do some things on that side? I guess I'm watching to see how Minnesota responds to the type of looks that, Rob Smith deploys.
Speaking of which, you're intimately familiar with Rob Smith's defense, given that he was the coordinator at Minnesota under PJ Fleck. Before we get into how Minnesota matches up with this Rutgers defense, just can you kind of talk through why this Rob Smith defense kind of struggles in the against modern offenses? Because, we've been through it a few times now. The numbers speak for themselves with Rutgers defense this year. And From what we were talking about off pod, it sounds like your experience last time with Rob Smith in Minnesota very much mirrors what we're experiencing this year. So can you speak through why Rob Smith's defenses kind of struggle?
Yeah, I just think it's discipline, fundamental type of stuff, being able to leverage the ball carrier, set the edge, linebackers and safeties playing with, tight fundamentals. I think it's a layered thing. When you look at defenses that are having problems, a lot of times, there's a mistake in the front 7, there's a mistake in the second level, and then the safety's getting blamed because they got to take the right angle, they got to make a hero play. And I think there was a lot of situations in Minnesota when Smith was here that like the safety has to take the perfect angle, make the hero play, make the tackle, because maybe you weren't as detailed in the front. You were out of a gap, weren't able to get off a block at the linebacker position. Maybe you couldn't set the edge with consistency. I think that's what I've noticed, with Rutgers defense is a lot of problems versus mobile quarterbacks, ends being very aggressive. He's going to play a lot of cover one robber type of stuff to be very physical with his defensive backs. So I think that puts you in positions where, you're naturally going to give up some bigger plays. I didn't think the Rutgers cornerbacks, I think they're exploitable, out on the perimeter, being able to get them in spots, or maybe you run some crack tosses, some counter stuff to get them actively involved in the run game and the run fits. But I think it's like a run fit detail thing. They're going to use some quarters and cover one, and they're just not super precise and detailed all the time in those areas.
So knowing that, how would you attack, or how does this Minnesota offense match up with the Rutgers defense, and how would you attack it if you were calling the plays?
Yeah, I think attacking the perimeter, like I say, maybe it's like pin and pull, maybe it's counter, crack tosses, trying to get their cornerbacks in a position where, they have to crack, replace, and be involved in the run game. I think that's where I would attack, is the perimeter. Maybe some wildcat packages, trying to get some creativity, make them have to, defend disciplined on the edge. The run game's got to be all about, attacking eye discipline. Can you get some jet sweeps? Can you motion people around, shift, get into some unconventional looks? I think, like I say, that 6 offensive line package might be something that's advantageous for Minnesota. And then I think, being able to, when Rutgers, you get into a 3rd and long situation, be able to throw the ball down the field, win one-on-one matchups. I think there's going to be some times where Minnesota might try to draw a flag. I think Rutgers defensive backs are very aggressive and physical. And I think that's something that Minnesota is going to attack. You're going to see some downfield stuff, like scissors concepts where you got guys, stacked up, and maybe you can run a corner and a post together to try to create, some conflict and get guys open naturally through rubs and designs like that based on their coverage structures. I think Minnesota's man concept beating stuff in the passing game is going to be very important. And can you stay on track offensively? I don't think this is a game where you want to be, backed up behind the sticks and have to win one-on-one on the outside. I think Rutgers wins that game against Iowa without the holding penalty on 3rd down. I mean, that's a W. I mean, gosh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and Rutgers defensive backs are aggressive. It was an aggressive game from Iowa. I thought, that was just a battle in the defensive backfield. And I think it's going to be the same way in this game. Is Minnesota's secondary able to hold up against Rutgers wide receivers? And then vice versa. Can Minnesota run the ball against, Rutgers defensive front? I think those are the 2 variables that are going to be very important to watch in this game.
All right, now let's flip it over to the other side of the ball, kind of like you alluded to. So Corey Heatherman, another guy that we're all pretty intimately familiar with, left from Miami. Danny Collins, who's the safeties coach and has been with PJ Fleck for years now, steps in. I guess, how has the defense looked in the wake of Heatherman leaving, and how has Danny Collins done so far in the full-time role?
I think the hard thing here, you guys, is like you have two sample sizes of games, really, because you played Buffalo and, you played Cal. The Northwestern State game was like a preseason game. So I really don't think you learn that much. I think I've always been a guy that, like, it takes 4 quality games to kind of figure out, what you got, what's going right, what's not. I think the big thing in the Cal game was, like, not enough consistency and communication in the back end. Are your zone drops tight? Are you able to play disciplined, be in the right spot, align correctly? That was kind of the thing that Cal did a lot, was showing various formations, bunching, stacking, motioning, shifting, giving a ton of different looks. And so Minnesota has to be able to match up better to those things, communicate with urgency, be able to be detailed in what they're doing coverage-wise, and be able to rush the passer with a little bit more consistency with rush lane discipline. You look at JKS at California, stud freshman quarterback. He was able to, move around and make some plays with his legs, buy time, and put a lot of pressure on the coverage. And I think when Minnesota was successful with Corey Heatherman, rush and coverage complemented each other quite well. I think that's where they got to get to the point of now rush has to be able to pin and compress the pocket. Can you change the picture in the back and get your hand on the ball, create a takeaway? So I think right now the big challenge, moving into Big Ten play is, can you play with better coverage detail, better discipline, and be able to rush the passer? I think the interior of the pass rush, through the first couple games, it's been, they'd like to get more production out of that area. So I think just the detail, communication, getting reps as a collective unit is something that is going to be important as this defense learns and grows.
And only one turnover forced so far. You kind of touched on the inconsistency rushing the passer. How big of a piece does that play in it? And what do you think has been the biggest catalyst in not being able to take the ball away?
Yeah, I think it's rush and coverage working together. I think when Minnesota was creating takeaways early last season, it was because rush and coverage were playing off each other. Whether that's you're showing a single high look pre-snap, and then you're coming out into some unconventional, like invert coverage where you're playing like a variation of Tampa 2 and people are rolling out into different coverages. So the quarterback not only has to deal with a compressed pocket and impeded vision windows, but then you've got, a coverage picture change where somebody's dropping into an unconventional zone to get their hand on the ball, takeaway. So I think it's all about detail, being able to win up front with 4 rushers, and then be able to change the coverage picture, blending in pressure when you need to, but also just being sound with rush and 4, playing, detail coverage. I think that helps you be able to get your hands on the football more consistently. You look at last year, they were like the number 1 defense in defensive back havoc rate last year. So that measures the percentage of defensive plays that, you create a pass breakup or get an interception. They were good in the first half of the season in that area, and then I think it's kind of bled into this year that now your pass rush has to take over. They lost some key players on defense. Ja Joyner up front, Danny Strigow, Cody Lindenberg at the linebacker room, Justin Wally at corner, Ethan Robinson, quality players that I think, they're going through a transition on defense, and they got to get some reps together and figure out what works schematically for them.
Yeah, it seems like other than Anthony Smith up front, you guys have kind of struggled to get pass rush this year. Would you say that's a fair assessment of where the defensive line stands from a pass rush standpoint?
Yeah, and I think, that was a unique type of situation last week. I thought that Brian Harsin, the OC at Cal, did a great job changing the launch points for the quarterback, like rolling the pocket, sprinting it out, really forcing Minnesota to have to play with good rush lane discipline and not getting them in situations where they can just compress the pocket, retrace the rush, and, get after the quarterback. So I think rush lane discipline is the one thing that Minnesota has to work on entering this game specifically, is like, does your rush get too far up the field? If it does, can your defensive tackle retrace, keep the quarterback in the pocket, and then you got your edges able to come in and retrace as well to pick up some sacks. So I think working collectively as a rush is important, being able to get more pressure from the interior of the defensive line. You saw that in the FBS games. They weren't as consistent in that area. And losing Danny Strigow, a rush end, who I think was very underrated, productive player, efficient week to week. They're undergoing transition at the rush end position. They've used Jackson Howard there. They've used Carter Menz more in the passing situations. But can they get some more production at defensive tackle and rush end to give some, other juice outside of Anthony Smith?
And now with the linebackers, you mentioned Cody Lindenberg, a guy who's that classic, college football rock of the defense. You mentioned kind of the discipline and the angles for the run game. I feel like the linebackers also play a huge part in that. What does that unit look like this year, and how has that progressed as the season's gone on?
Yeah, I think the linebackers are doing a solid job this year. Mariano Sori-Marin's a linebackers coach. He used to play at Minnesota. Young guy, one of the younger coaches in the entire FBS, and kind of off the Joe Rossi tree of linebacker play. And I think he's done a great job developing guys, putting players in good positions for success. Maverick Baranowski's the main leader of that room, the voice. He's developed a lot, just learning to play, within the system, being able to play with disciplined eyes, knowing what type of run fits Minnesota is going to use versus different schemes. I think he's made great progress. Dev Williams, I think he's helped a lot in the pressure game. Someone that they can, move around and do some creative things with in that capacity, but also kind of a guy that can pursue a chase and has good, lateral quickness to chase stuff down and pursue. And then Joey Gerlach's kind of come in as a passing downs type of guy that they can mug around and do some creative stuff with because of his athletic ability. Matt Kingsbury, another guy that, has been developing behind the scenes. Physical player. I think he's still learning how to, play within the defense. He's very aggressive, and I think, reining that in to a certain degree is something that Minnesota is continuing to work on to play within the structure of the defense. But linebacker's been pretty solid for Minnesota.
Moving on to the secondary, you could tell me if I'm wrong. This was, to me, a position that I thought would be amongst the strengths of Minnesota this year. You have the returning freshman All-American, Coy Perich, kind of the do-everything guy. He's playing a lot on offense. Obviously, he's starting on defense. He's your primary kick returner. Kerry Brown was another guy who came into the season with a lot of hype, and he's kind of not played up to probably his standard.
Yep.
Kind of speak to, is it just a lot of like mental mistakes? Like speak to kind of what's going on with the secondary and why things kind of haven't gone as, I guess, people thought they would this year.
Well, I think the safety room, you had a lot of talent coming back. You want to figure out how you can get as many safeties on the field as possible. So you see Minnesota, using some dime occasionally to get their defensive backs on the field. So they're playing zone. And I think it's just like communication, being able to play at the appropriate zone drop, have everybody crisply executing at a high level when they're running those type of schemes. And I think that's what Corey Heatherman was so good at. Now you watch Miami and it's like, this has got to be like some of the crispest zone drop, zone coverage you're going to see. I mean, that guy can coach that stuff up. So I look at Minnesota right now, they're trying to get as many defensive backs as they can on the field. And when you have a lot of safeties, I think that teams are, being aggressive, trying to throw the ball down the field because, maybe they're not as skilled in the coverage area. Maybe they're not as good if you can get them isolated with certain route combinations where they've got to try to cover one-on-one or, make a split-second decision where they got to pass a guy off or, put them in conflict. And I think that was what I noticed in the Cal game was just not enough precision and detail. The cornerback room is going through some transition too. I mean, Justin Wally to the pros, Ethan Robinson departed. So you got Zaquan Bryan, who's played a little bit, but not a lot. John Nestor was a transfer out of Iowa, late transfer out in the spring. So he comes in here and they got two new corners working with, a group of experienced safeties. So I think, what does the scheme look like coming out of this Cal game, out of the bye week? What adjustments are they able to make? Can they play with crisper detail in what they're trying to execute in the mix of coverages?
And I want to give the defense for Minnesota its flowers because the numbers themselves kind of are extremely impressive this year. Number one total defense, number one in EPA per play allowed, 17th in adjusted EPA per play allowed, 8th in yards per play, 6th in success rate allowed. Kind of, are the numbers a bit deceiving, or where would you? Because obviously the Northwestern State game is kind of pulling a lot of these numbers down. You allowed like 42 yards of total offense that game. The Cal game, I think you guys had close to 400 yards of total offense allowed. So, how good is this Minnesota defense in your opinion through 3 games?
Here's what I think is interesting. I think this is why context is so important. Like data, I love data. I'm the biggest data guy ever. But I think like when you look, you got to look at each game isolated. You look at Buffalo. That was a team that, they were very centric in the run game. They did not have the ability to push the ball down the field. So Minnesota's game plan was load the box, force them to have to throw the ball down the field, do everything you can to take away the run and, play really sound one-on-one coverage on the outside. Northwestern State, obviously an anomaly, pretty much a preseason game. Third game here, you play Cal, and that's a team that doesn't run the ball a lot. You look at it, they're throwing the rock 70% of the time. They're barely running the ball. But they were able to get 2 timely runs, toward the end of that game that gave them a spark offensively. So I look at they played, two different styles of teams. One that, really leans on the run, one that can rip it all over the yard. So now I want to see when you play a team that can run it and throw it, what type of scheme do you use? Is your scheme different? It was more of, stop the run versus Buffalo. It was more play with a lot of safeties, force the quarterback to have to process the windows. Now I think against Rutgers, when you see a guy like Kirk, I mean, I wrote about it on the website. How do you scheme this game where it's like you play zone, you're going to get RPO. If you want to, eventually, if you want to take away the RPO, you're probably going to play, a little bit more man. Then you're going to be throwing the ball down the field. So I think you're going to have to strike that balance between, what type of coverages are you going to use? Are you going to use some, simulated pressures where you're able to drop ends to try to make it harder to identify the conflict guy in RPO? I think this will be the biggest challenge Minnesota's faced because they have the threat to run it and the threat to throw it. And I think Antoine Raymond's been outstanding. I like that guy. I think he's a really good player. Kirk, I think coming into the year probably thought, I don't have that number one bell cow type of guy. I got, multiple dudes I can rotate. But, man, I think Raymond's emerged. I think he's done a nice job.
And now we move on to the third phase of the game, of course, one that both coaches hold very dearly, special teams.
Yes, sir.
So I guess the one thing that kind of sticks out, the Minnesota's kicker has not been great to start out his career. He's only 3 of 10 from 40-plus yards. There have been a couple mistakes as well. Coy Parrish had an error against Cal, I believe. So with that unit, Rutgers has had struggles as well. How are they kind of working on fixing some of the errors that Minnesota's had?
Yeah, I think it's just decision making. You got Coy Parrish catching a punt at the 2. You got a ball on the ground bouncing, tries to pick it up, muffs it, and then they get a TD a few plays later. Like those field position, that hidden yardage, people have no idea how field position margin impacts the outcome of games. I mean, Greg Schiano is like the captain. That was the field position game between him and Kirk Ferentz, and the special teams having a huge role in that game. I look at this matchup, you mentioned the kicker, 40-plus yards. When you get on the edge of that area, you got to start thinking about, do you go for it? He's not as proficient in the long distance category. I think the punting's been solid. They've been able to, use some bounce and down some balls inside the 5. I thought that was a huge factor in the Buffalo game was the punting. They were able to make multiple field goals in that game, which ultimately ended up being really, really important. But I look at PJ Fleck, you look at games where they're able to win that field position margin and have a positive field position margin. They win like 78% of the time. So, you look at the first couple games, they're able to win the field position margin. I think they lost it by 13 some yards against Cal. Tough hill to climb, especially when it influences the outcome of games as much as it does.
And I forgot one thing on the defense. How do you feel like this Minnesota defense matches up against Rutgers offense? And if you were calling plays on defense, where would you kind of try and attack Rutgers offense?
Well, Kirk Shiraka, I think he's going to come out with something. He will come out with something unconventional. I'm interested to see what it is. Like, is it going to be maybe they come out 4 wide or something, just something really, really unique that Minnesota wouldn't be anticipating, because he knows that Minnesota is going to have an idea of like, here's what Kirk likes to do. That's the unique thing. People talk about that it's not a big deal that, there's familiarity there. There's definitely like some knowledge in terms of like here's how Kirk likes to attack things. What does he do different that maybe Minnesota doesn't see coming? Is it unconventional personnel grouping? Is it to just spread the field? I think that might be the deal. Just spread it out and just go empty and try to let it rip. Maybe that's some of it. But I also think like the RPO game, for Minnesota to stop that, maybe it's like dropping an end into the underneath window using some simulated pressure or creeper pressure. I think some of it might be, too high man under type of defense where you're able to contest, and disrupt the timing of the quick game. But then, hey, you're going to get hit over the top a couple of times, and you're going to have to be able to cover one-on-one. And I think that's the storyline to watch in this game. Can Minnesota, when they need to, there are going to be opportunities one-on-one. Can they win those matchups? do they have, the tight fundamentals and sound cornerback play to be able to hold up against these wide receivers? And then, it's the balancing act of Kirk's going to run the ball. If you're spreading it out, trying to defend the pass and you have lighter boxes, that's when Kirk's going to run the football. So I think this is a multi-dimensional offense that can attack you in a lot of different ways. So I think this is the first huge challenge for Minnesota when it comes to be able to defend everything against an OC that has answers for a lot of different things that you might do.
And you talked about Kirk probably coming out with something exotic or something unexpected. I do think that this is kind of a kitchen sink game for Rutgers because you look at the schedule, they do not have, not to say anything negative about Minnesota, but this is one of the 3 or 4, realistically winnable games left on their schedule. Yep. And they're sitting at 3-1 right now. So you have a very narrow path to a bowl game. Yep. And you lose this game and it becomes 0 margin for error the rest of the year. And you have a bye after this game. So I feel like the staff is going to put everything they got into trying winning this game. That includes maybe some, looks that we haven't seen yet this year. Maybe some looks that they've set up all season to go to, maybe a play action off of a play that they've, run every single time. I don't know. We'll see what it is.
Kirk probably left the stadium after the Iowa game and was in the lab immediately, like preparing, coming up with something. That guy, like he's putting in the time, he's putting in the work. He's going to have something exotic. Like you say, I think this is like a bowl game. That's what I was saying to somebody the other day. This is a bowl game for Rutgers. They have to win this game. There's a lot of pressure there. I think it's a big game for Minnesota too. Because I think Minnesota coming out of a bye, kind of setting the tone for Big Ten play. You want to see a response out of this Cal game. How does the team respond to a big test against a team that, is going to be very well coached in a lot of areas?
All right. Well, let's get to the fun part, predicting the game. So, Danny, I guess you're our guest, so we'll let you go first. What do you think? You have a score prediction, and how do you think this game's going to roll?
Oh man, I don't know how this game's going to go. I think it could be high scoring. I think, people, what is it? The over under 51 and a half. What is it right now?
50 and a half right now on FanDuel.
50 and a half. I think the team that can score 30 ends up winning this game. The first one to 30, it might seem unconventional that like this is going to be, I've seen a lot of people say this is going to be a low scoring game, but I truly feel that, looking at both teams, whoever can get to 30 is going to win this thing. I think there's going to be some big plays and some offense on display. So that's what I'd say. First to 30 gets the dub.
And do you have a team that you think gets to 30 first?
I think, honestly, dude, I think that like the game flow is kind of going to dictate this. I think if Rutgers comes out and they get in a position where, they got a 14-point lead, 10-point lead, and they get Minnesota climbing, then I think, Rutgers is going to put themselves in a position to win like a 30 to, 24 type of game. Or if Minnesota gets off to a quick start and they get Rutgers climbing a little bit and they're able to get after Athan with the pass rush and mix some looks, then I think it's like a 30 to 24 type of game for Minnesota. So that's what I would say is the first 15 minutes of the game are going to determine who ends up winning it.
All right, the politically correct answer there, not going to give us a firm prediction. I appreciate I had to try. But
I don't know. I think it's going to be I think it can go either way, man.
All right, Alec, let's hear how you think this game plays out, and let's get your score prediction.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is going to be a first to 30 wins. And I think, like we kind of talked about, Rutgers is going to have a lot on the table. I feel like it's a bit of a misconception when you talk about, as the season goes on, you kind of unlock more of the playbook. It's not like you have a set, part of the playbook that you're holding back. It's just kind of layering things on top of the concepts you're already putting out there. So I think Rutgers is going to do that in this game. I think as long as Athan Kaliakmanis can stay upright and this offensive line can kind of have a bounce back game after Kaliakmanis was sacked a few times against Iowa, as long as they can keep him upright, I think Rutgers has the offensive horses to pull away in this game. I think they win, I'll go 31-27. I do think Minnesota's offense is going to be able to move the ball, but I think Rutgers ends up getting the last laugh. I'm going to say 31-27.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that Minnesota doesn't do well aligns with what Rutgers does well, and vice versa. Like, Minnesota doesn't really force a ton of turnovers. We don't really turn the ball over. Minnesota doesn't really run the ball well. We don't defend the run well. So I think those kind of, matchups where, there is an advantage versus not an advantage, I think that'll be key. Like, if Minnesota can come out and run the ball against us with, whoever they, have as the number one back, whether it be Davis or whether it be Fame, that's what killed us against Iowa. Is we just weren't able to stop like basic run concepts. And then, layering the QB run game won't be an issue this week, but that killed us doubly because, just when we thought we had a guy bottled up, Gronowski was making the right decision to pull and keep. So I think having that reprieve of not going against a running quarterback too will be huge for this defense to kind of play maybe a little bit more fundamentally sound. I'm not fully convinced. I also think it's going to be high scoring, but I think Rutgers kind of knows if they lose this game, the season is functionally over for them. So I think, like you said, they're going to treat it like a bowl game. Schiano typically does good in these back to the wall situations. If you look at the last few years, outside of that Maryland game 3 years ago. So I'm going to say Rutgers finds a way to win, but it is high scoring. I'm going to say 34-28. The over hits. I think the overs hit every game this season for Rutgers. I think the over almost hit in the first half last week against Iowa. But I think Rutgers finds a way to win.
What was the term the Iowa guys had last week for
Rovers?
Yes,
Rutgers
the Rovers,
overs.
the Rutgers overs, yeah.
Daniel, you've been great with your time. Are there any questions you have for us about this game or about Rutgers before we kind of sign off here?
Yeah, I'm curious in the linebacker room with Moses Walker. I mean, an injury looked pretty serious. I mean, what that creates a layer to me, like what the situation's like.
If I had to guess, I would say he's probably out. He got carted off the field following his injury on Friday. The linebacker depth behind him, Greg Schiano talks about Abram Wright being like the third starting linebacker, even though they're a 4-2-5 base. So Abram Wright will have to step up there, but he got injured against Minnesota last year. He had, I believe, an ACL or an Achilles injury, celebrating a big stop. And so I think
it was the safety.
Yeah, it was the safety. Sorry. So he's not 100%. I mean, he is 100% in terms of he's playing and he's not hobbled, but he's obviously still rounding back into form. And then they got Austin Dean, who is a former Rutgers player who transferred to Georgia Tech, who didn't play there, and now he's a backup. And then a young guy in Sam Robinson. So there is a definite opportunity to exploit our linebacker play because it has not been great even with Moses Walker on the field.
I think that's what makes this game, a little bit more difficult to predict than others because both these coaches are so tight-lipped when it comes to who's available, who's not. They're playing the cat and mouse game. So, you're not going to know from a personnel standpoint who's playing, who's going to be out there, and how will they maybe do certain things schematically based on, the personnel. So I think that complicates things as well. It's just like, man, both these coaches have such similar styles in how they present information.
It is funny listening to PJ Fleck press conferences because there's so much shared nomenclature between him and Greg where it's just like the same sayings, the same, mentality, and comparing that to listening to Kirk Ferentz speak last week when I was listening to a lot of his pressers. Yeah. When a reporter, first off, he goes 25 minutes talking to the media. He makes his coordinators available. Somebody asks a direct question and he gives a direct answer. Like, what's the status of X player? Oh, he's not going to be playing this week. We're expecting him back by this week. It's like, what? You're telling people real information? What is this?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hard part. I think, like, especially in college football, like week to week, it's hard to know because like coaches are different in how they, present that stuff. You get the injury report 2 hours before kickoff, but that doesn't do much for you because you're at the point where, the hay's already in the barn, you're not making your predictions 2 hours before kickoff. So I think the injury piece is big in this game. Who's available, who's not. That really changes things because Rutgers is beat up. Minnesota's got a couple of key injuries. So, this is going to be a fun game. I'm excited for it.
Yeah, if Darius Taylor was 100% healthy in this game, I don't think I wouldn't pick Rutgers to win the game, because I think you then could just kind of, because Darius Taylor, he's good in the receiving game. He's just kind of the guy who, in tight spaces, he always finds a way to get that extra yard or two. He always falls forward. Like, he's a dog, and he wears you down. By the end of the game, somehow, you didn't think he put that much on you, but then those fourth quarter runs is where he really gets the piles on the yardage. So if he does play and he's even close to 100%, I don't think Rutgers can win.
Yeah, and I think last year you look at this matchup, Rutgers had the bye week coming into the matchup between these two teams last year. Now Minnesota has the bye week coming in. So how does that impact the game? What changes are made? The familiarity that you already have, gosh, this is a storyline heavy event.
Absolutely. And Daniel, we really appreciate your time and for joining us. Tell our listeners where they can find your work and where they can find you on social media.
You can find my work at gophersguru.com, $5 a month for the subscription package, gets you access to all the analysis. And then on Twitter, tweeting about the Big Ten and the Gophers at Daniel House MN. So you can check me out there.
Awesome. You've been an incredible guest. We really appreciate all your extensive knowledge on the Gophers, and let's hope it's another memorable one in a long line of memorable games between the Rutgers Scarlet Knights and the Minnesota Golden Gophers. But that is it for us today. Hopefully you have your bet in by the end of this pod on FanDuel, because I think we got some great insight for you guys. But for me and Alec, this has been another edition of the Knight Report podcast, signing off.